Every October, I look forward to rewatching John Landis's An American Werewolf in London. I literally watch it countless of times during the Halloween season. It's not only my favorite horror movie, but one of my favorite movies in general. Landis created such a special comedy-horror hybrid with likable characters, great music, and revolutionary visual effects. What's not to love? When I started my YouTube channel this year, I knew early on that my first spooky special would focus on this film. However, while doing my research, I discovered that all werewolf films are connected one way or another. It's the type of genre that continuously evolves after every movie. To talk about just one 1981 film would be missing the bigger picture. Having realized this early on in my reading, I decided that I should contextualize the entire genre instead. In this episode, I'll be discussing the history of werewolves on film, beginning with the roots of werewolf mythology and ending with the modern werewolves of the new millennium. In between, I'll talk about how the genre became popular through Universal's iconic monster films of the 1930s and 40s, the making of the Wolfman, the impact of screenwriter Curt Siodmak to werewolf culture, the production and pop culture influence of John Landis's An American Werewolf in London, and the revolutionary makeup of Rick Baker. Before we get into the Hollywoodness of it all, I think it's very important to discuss the origins of this famous monster myth. Where did the werewolf actually originate? To be honest, I don't know. The truth is, nobody does. While most scholars cite very early accounts of werewolves in literature, there really isn't a specific date or story that truly tells us where they actually come from. As writer Bill Ponzini states in his book, the origin of the werewolf superstition is lost in antiquity. Look, I read every academic journal I could find online, and everybody seems to have their own ideas. However, there was one common thread between all the research. Most writers agree that the conception of a werewolf mythology probably began with the ancient civilizations, all of which have their own folklore of humans turning into some form of animal, usually by using magic, or making a deal with a god, or by eating an enchanted herb. The beasts used in these old legends vary by region, depending on what that particular civilization considered dangerous or sacred. Wolves, in particular, are commonly found in North America and Europe, so it's only natural that folklore from these regions had these canines at the center of their stories. One of the earliest recordings of werewolves in literature comes from the Roman poet Virgil in 39 BC. In his 8th eclogue, Virgil describes seeing a man turn into a wolf by choice. By the 11th century, the Anglo-Saxons finally gave these shapeshifters a name. They called it werewolf, which roughly translates to man-wolf. As the years went by, these stories transformed as they were passed on from one generation to the next. Each storyteller told their children something a little bit different until it took the form of the werewolf myth we know today. Hollywood, as you'll learn later, played the most crucial part. By the Middle Ages, people in Europe feared the notorious werewolf. Predominantly, the fascination for lycanthropy mushroomed in France. Lycanthropy is commonly used as the medical term for werewolfism. I say medical term because in the 1500s, people considered lycanthropy a mental illness rather than something supernatural. According to Dr. Franklin R. Ruel, who contributed to The Werewolf Book, the Encyclopedia of Shape-Shifting Beings, the most notorious case of lycanthropy happened in the small French village of Dole in the 1570s. Gilles Garnier was a peasant who went on a 4-month rampage. He killed 4 children, whose flesh he devoured before howling at the moon. Garnier was then convicted for being a werewolf and was burned alive on January 18, 1573. There are literally hundreds of stories about lycanthropy from this time. For further reading, I highly recommend Charlotte F. Oden's book, A Lycanthropy Reader, Werewolves in Western Culture, which compiles all of these accounts. In the 19th century, werewolves became a form of literary entertainment. Various novels were published in this century. Some notable ones include Sutherland Menzies' Hughes the Werewolf, A Kentish Legend of the Middle Ages, George W. M. Reynolds' Wagner the Werewolf, Clemens Hausmann's The Werewolf, and finally Bram Stoker's Dracula, which featured the titular vampire shape-shifting into a wolf. However, it was 1933's The Werewolf of Paris by Galliodore which truly captured people's imaginations. The story follows werewolf Bertrand Calais and his life throughout the France-Prussian War. The novel would later become the basis of a 1961 film which we'll talk a little bit about later. The Werewolf of Paris is often considered the definitive werewolf novel. It did for werewolf fiction what Dracula did for vampires. By the 1930s, werewolves were pretty much a part of popular culture, although they weren't exactly the kind of werewolves we're used to seeing in the movies today. There was nothing about silver bullets or the full moon or anything like that. They were simply people, or in Dracula's case, a vampire, who could turn into wolves. The next decade would change werewolf mythology forever, all in thanks to Universal Pictures and a creative genius named Curt Siodmak. In 1925, Universal Pictures released The Phantom of the Opera. Based on the 1910 novel by Gaston Leroux, the story follows a deformed phantom who haunts the Paris Opera House. Lon Chaney starred in the titular role. The film's success prompted the studio to start developing more monster pictures. In subsequent years, they produced and released a handful of feature films that would define the horror genre forever. Dracula and Frankenstein, both released in 1931, was their biggest successes. Often hailed as two of the most influential horror movies ever made, they introduced almost all the cinematic gothic horror tropes we know today. Think the dark shadowy atmospheres, the tortured heroes, the tragic romances, and the grotesque makeup. All of these were born from the brilliant artistic minds at Universal Pictures. Many of these tropes are still very evident in horror movies today. With the success of Dracula and Frankenstein, Universal realized that they had a good money-making formula. This encouraged them to continue searching for other monster properties for their stars Bela Lugosi and Boris Karloff. They eventually landed on the werewolf myth and developed an original story called Werewolf of London in 1936. The plot follows a scientist who is bitten by a werewolf while searching for a rare flower in Tibet. Due to scheduling conflicts, Lugosi and Karloff were unavailable for the project. Universal then hired stage actor Henry Hall for the leading role instead. The studio also brought in makeup artist Jack Pierce to design the werewolf makeup. Pierce was the artist responsible for creating the iconic look of Frankenstein's monster. Unfortunately, star Henry Hall didn't want to be unrecognizable when in wolf form, prompting Pierce to create a more minimalist look. Although Universal thought they had another hit in their hands, Werewolf of London did not perform well critically or financially. It looked as if werewolf cinema was over before it really began. 1 year later, Universal Pictures was in financial ruin. The original partners would lose control of the studio when the Standard Capital Corporation would buy it for $55 million. The new owners decided to distance themselves from the horror genre, opting instead to make low-budget comedies, action flicks, and movie musicals. This was an effort to try and improve the studio's financial problems. However, it proved to be unsuccessful. Nate Bloomberg, an advisor with the CBS Broadcast Group, was then brought in to manage Universal. The first thing Bloomberg did was reissue Frankenstein and Dracula as a double feature across theaters in the country. This re-release was very popular with audiences and encouraged the studio to once again embrace their horror identity. The second wave of Universal monster movies began with Son of Frankenstein in 1939. Its first-day ticket returns topped any monster movie Universal had previously released. Financially stable once again, the studio was eager to complete their big four monsters, which included Dracula, Frankenstein's monster, and the Mummy. They decided to try their hand in developing another werewolf tale that would build up their new leading man, Lon Chaney Jr. While Chaney Jr. was just a bit player in Hollywood, Universal hoped that they could capitalize on his famous last name. His father, known to the world as the Man with 1,000 Faces, had a deep history with the studio, playing the original Phantom of the Opera and Quasimodo in the Hunchback of Notre Dame. By using his name, Universal hoped for the same kind of success. They eventually came up with the idea of the Wolfman, an original story that would change werewolf mythology forever. George Wagner, who had worked with Chaney before in Man-Made Monster, was set to direct. German writer Curt Siodmak was brought in to pen the script. Today, Siodmak is considered to have single-handedly created modern werewolf lore from his imagination. J. Robert Craig writes in his article, Siodmak included a number of rules that have become commonplace for later werewolf films. Included among these tenets are the need to subdue the werewolf with a silver bullet or bludgeon it with a silver object, such as the walking stick seen in the film, the transference of the curse from one person to another when the existing werewolf bites its victims who, nonetheless survives, a carryover from Werewolf of London, the sign of the pentagram in the hand of its next victim, the werewolf's aversion to wolfbane, and of course, Siodmak's ditty that is spoken early in the film not once, but 3 times, to be sure that viewers recognizes that someone will turn into a werewolf when the full moon rises in the film. Often falsely attributed to existing mythology, the poem, even a man who's pure in heart and says his prayers by night, may become a wolf when the wolfbane blooms and the autumn moon is bright, was solely Siodmak's creation. Siodmak, who was a Jewish refugee from Germany, also incorporated into the film a lot of his experiences from the Holocaust. For instance, he remembered how his once friendly neighbors viciously turned into monsters, similar to werewolves, when they would see Jews marked with a pentagram, the gold star, based on the Star of David. Another major contribution the writer made was to make the monster a sympathetic character. While other Universal monsters wanted to prolong their lives, the Wolfman was always finding ways to end it. Dracula wants blood and everlasting life, while the Wolfman wants to end his life, ashamed of what he may do. The longing for death would continue on with all of the Lon Chaney werewolf films of the 1940s. The Wolfman follows Larry Talbot, a young man who returns to his ancestral home in Wales to bury his deceased brother with his estranged father, played by Claude Rains. While he's there, he is bitten by a werewolf. In the next few days, he attacks and kills villagers. Ultimately, he is hunted down, and yeah, you get the picture. While the plot seems thin from the outside, the devil is really in the details. George Wagner directs it with a dark, gothic atmosphere. It's gorgeous to look at. Siodmak's script is strong and imaginative. Jack Pierce, back again to do the werewolf makeup, creates an iconic look for the leading man. And finally, Lon Chaney Jr. gives a tortured, nuanced performance. You see the pain and worry behind the eyes of his Larry Talbot. When The Wolfman was released in theaters, critics dismissed the film as a fun and ridiculous monster flick. However, movie-going audiences absolutely loved it. It recuperated its $180,000 budget in no time and eventually earned over $1 million at the box office. To capitalize on its success, Universal started creating monster mash movies. Think of it as the 1940s version of the MCU, but instead of superheroes, you've got gothic monsters. Lon Chaney Jr. would reprise his werewolf role in films such as Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman, House of Frankenstein, and House of Dracula, all of which brought in big bucks while being made on very small budgets. Eventually, Universal would be sold again to a company called International. It was 1936 all over again. The new owners wanted to distance themselves from horror, but was once again forced to come back to the genre when they were in financial ruin. While the studio was able to save itself with Abbott and Costello Meets Frankenstein in 1948, it wasn't long before monster films truly fizzled out. As the 1950s loomed, sci-fi was all the rage. UFOs, aliens, and space was the thing of the future. Gothic horror was on its way out. It did, however, have a small resurgence during the 1950s when Universal's back catalog was sold and aired on local TV stations across the country. Many young people were introduced to the classic Universal monster for the first time. Among them was future filmmaker John Landis and makeup design extraordinaire Rick Baker, who would later revitalize the werewolf genre in the 1980s. In In the next couple of decades, werewolf movies remained in popular culture but never truly struck a chord the same way The Wolfman did in 1941. Some notable films include 1957's I Was a Teenage Werewolf, which used the concept of werewolfism as an allegory for puberty. There was also The Boy Who Cried Werewolf from the 1970s, which features a very groovy-looking werewolf. I haven't seen every werewolf movie from the post-40s, pre-80s period, but from what I have seen, the best would probably be Terence Fisher's 1961 film Curse of the Werewolf starring Oliver Reed. Based on the popular novel The Werewolf of Paris, which I mentioned earlier in this episode, the film is well crafted and entertaining. Unsurprisingly, Oliver Reed knocks it out of the park. While some werewolf films did better than others, people pretty much saw the genre as a dying art in the late 60s and 70s. What the world didn't know is that a young man named John Landis was about to enter the scene. In 1969, a teenage John Landis was in Yugoslavia working as a gopher for an MGM film called Kelly's Heroes. On his free time, he witnessed a gypsy funeral on the street where they were burying a person wrapped in cloth, rosaries, and garlic. The young man was fascinated and asked his fellow crew member, a Yugoslav named Sasha, what they were doing. Sasha replied that the dead had committed terrible crimes and they were burying him this way so that the body could not rise from the dead and cause more trouble. Landis kept thinking about this surreal experience. As a child who fell in love with the classic Universal monster movies, he made up his mind. One day, he would make a monster movie too. He began researching occult figures such as vampires, ghosts, and zombies before developing a fascination for werewolves and their rich mythology. He quickly started writing a horror comedy werewolf film, setting it in London, which was the home of Gothic horror. Landis titled his film An American Werewolf in London, which tells the story of two young American boys named Jack and David who find themselves in the English moors while on a backpacking trip across Europe. There, they are attacked by a wolf-like creature. Jack is instantly killed, while David survives. Days later, David awakens at a hospital in London where the undead spirit of his friend warns him that he will turn into a werewolf during the next full moon. Jack encourages David to kill himself so that his soul would be free from the undead curse, and also so David won't hurt any innocent people. David refuses to believe him. Eventually, David forms a strong bond with a young nurse named Alex, who invites him to stay at her flat before he flies back to America. And you've guessed it, folks, David does turn into a werewolf, wreaking havoc across the city. Landis finished the first draft of the screenplay at the tender age of 18. My inspiration was the old 1940s horror movie The Wolfman, starring Lon Chaney, in which, unusually, the werewolf was portrayed as a victim, he told Jack Watkins in an interview with The Guardian. A few years later, Landis was working as an actor, playing the titular schlock in the 1973 horror B-movie. On set, he met makeup artist Rick Baker and told him the premise of American Werewolf. Baker was riveted by Landis's passion project, especially with the idea of doing a gory werewolf transformation scene, a far cry from what old Hollywood was doing. Landis would later explain, films tended to show the transformation from man to wolf through dissolves, but I wanted to capture how painful the entire process would be and make it painful to watch. Although the film did have a lot of comedy, I wanted to treat the violence realistically to make it as terrible as violence always is. Baker promised to do the film if it was ever greenlit. However, as a barely legal Hollywood nobody, no major studio would get on board with this strange comic horror concept. An American Werewolf in London remained in his back pocket for the next decade. In the years to come, the wide-eyed teenager would become a seasoned director, making financially successful comedies such as The Kentucky Fried Movie, Animal House, and The Blues Brothers. After the massive success of The Blues Brothers, European production house Polygram Pictures finally gave Landis the money he needed to make his passion project. Landis then called Baker with the good news, but was shocked to find out that the makeup artist was already working on another werewolf film called The Howling, directed by Joe Dante. Landis was infuriated because Baker explained that he gave Dante all the werewolf transformation techniques he had dreamt of for an American Werewolf. Nonetheless, Baker wanted to stay true to his promise and left The Howling, leaving his young protege Rick Button in charge. The makeup artist told Landis that he had one major request, that he had to have the two main actors for at least 6 months before shooting began, so that he could work closely with them in designing the prosthetics. Landis then scrambled to find two young actors for the main roles of David and Jack. Landis cast actor Griffin Dunne in the role of Jack after one short meeting. He liked the actor's attitude and didn't require him to audition. As for the leading role of David Kessler, the director hired David Naughton completely out of instinct. At the time, the 20-something Naughton was the face of a very popular Dr. Pepper commercial. Landis saw him singing and dancing in these advertisements and hired him mainly because he looked like a likable guy. With the two main actors cast, Rick Baker got busy in creating his monsters. Principal photography began in early February of 1981 and ended around March or April of that same year. I won't talk too much about the making of the film because there is still so much more to cover, but if you're interested, there's an acclaimed 2008 documentary by Paul Davies called Beware of the Moon that does a deep dive on the production. The documentary features behind-the-scenes footage as well as in-depth interviews with the cast and crew. I would, however, like to take a moment to discuss the groundbreaking makeup effects of Rick Baker. Starting from scratch after leaving The Howling, Baker and his team of young artists dreamt up numerous looks for the film. Creativity flowed as Landis gave Baker the confidence and creative control to execute whatever was in his head. Apart from the titular werewolf, he had to create the looks of the Nazi demons, the decomposing undead, and other demonic monsters. Of course, Rick Baker's crowning achievement is the werewolf transformation, which was completely done with practical effects. His extraordinary work would go on to win him the first ever Academy Award for Best Makeup. As of today, Baker has won a total of 7 Oscars. Before moving on, here's a little clip about the making of the transformation scene featuring Baker and lead actor David Naughton.
Makeup artist Rick Baker took home an Oscar for turning David Naughton into a ferocious werewolf in the 1981 horror comedy An American Werewolf in London. This transformation required the work of 30 technicians and their assistants. Each stage of the metamorphosis had to be meticulously planned. The hard work paid off in one of Hollywood's most hair-raising scenes. Oscar winner Rick Baker.
The whole transformation itself took us about a week to shoot, but during that week we probably only shot for about a half an hour. You know, it was like, today we're going to do this makeup, it's going to take 10 hours on David Naughton, and then we're going to shoot it for 5 minutes, and then we're done, you know, because it takes too long to take it off and put another one on.
Now let's visit with the man who had to endure all those hours of preparation, actor David Naughton.
When I first got this role, I met Rick Baker, who did the makeup, and he said, "Are you playing the David character?" I said, "Yes, I am." He goes, "I feel sorry for you." I said, "You know, wait a second, this is like a real good role for me, or for any actor. What do you mean you feel sorry for me?" And he said, "You'll see." And I saw, right? I basically couldn't do anything but just sit there, you know, and sit there, and you know, 10 hours a day for 6 days of this transformation, and shoot for a couple hours, and then they said, go take the makeup off, you know, which would take about 3 hours. And see you tomorrow. We're going to do this again. And I tried to say, maybe I could leave the country.
You know, we had to take casts of his body in all kinds of weird positions, and there's not a lot of actors who would put up with it, and he was very good at it.
The hardest part was there's a point where the body actually stretches. It's no longer my body. My body's in the floor. They'd cut a hole in the floor. I was put into the floor. On a break, everyone would leave the set. I'd still be in the floor. They'd relight. I'd still be in the floor. And that was a tough day at work. But the payoff is, is a transformation unlike anything anybody's seen. And it won Rick an Academy Award.
And that was a rubber hand that we made that had little pneumatic rams in there that actually stretched the palm out. And you cut back to this other point of view, And now it was another hand, which was a different sculpture that was made to look a little more wolf-like, and that continued to stretch. And we just, because the frame was like here, you didn't see the elbow, David Naughton just had his arm down, and we were kneeling down underneath him holding this fake arm, and it just looked like it was part of his arm. There's a part of the transformation where you actually see the hair grow out of the skin, and that was really one of the first ideas I had on this transformation. It was one of the easiest things that we did in the transformation, but it gets a lot of response, and it was actually a reverse shot. What we did is implanted hair in just a little square piece of rubber and pulled the hair through, and when it was played in reverse, the hair grew out.
An American Werewolf in London premiered on August 21, 1981, to less than stellar reviews. Gary Arnold of the Washington Post called the film a minor fiasco destined for an obscure niche in the scrap heap of horror movies, while Time Out stated that Landis was too reliant on special effects. Most contemporary critics just couldn't get on board with the director's mix of comedy and horror, brushing the film off as a silly romp like the Universal monster movies that inspired it. If there was one positive thing that reviewers did mention, it was the makeup effects by Rick Baker. Peter Bradshaw of The Guardian wrote, after the tepid review, "The big man-to-wolf transformation scene is still a marvel. Despite mixed critical reaction, moviegoers embraced the film. This reimagined horror movie was something completely different from what they had seen before. It was new, it was hip, it was exciting. It was the complete opposite of the other two werewolf films released in 1981, The Howling and Wolfen. Today, the film has been re-evaluated as one of the most influential horror movies ever made. Historians have noted the slew of pictures that came out after it that tried to mimic the movie's unique genre-bending style. Pictures like Evil Dead 2, Gremlins, and Beetlejuice, amongst others, took their cues from An American Werewolf in London, mixing comedy with horrific gore. Even Michael Jackson was a big fan of the movie. He went as far as hiring both John Landis and Rick Baker to work on his Thriller music video in 1983. There are countless of articles that talk about the film's undeniable influence on the horror genre, and they're easy to find online. It's as quick as a Google search. While An American Werewolf in London wasn't embraced by critics in 1981, it has surely earned its place as a true cinematic classic. Many great films weren't recognized for their brilliance during their initial runs. For example, Jaws was brushed off by famed critics as a frivolous action flick, and Fight Club was panned and considered to be too dark. The list goes on and on. My point is, John Landis' film is in good company. Like many misunderstood movies that were critically berated in their time, An American Werewolf in London has clawed its way back into the hearts of cinephiles simply by being good. The proof is on celluloid. Landis' directorial style and witty screenplay makes it endlessly rewatchable. David Naughton is charming and committed to his role. The soundtrack is truly unique, using only songs with the word moon in them. And finally, Rick Baker's work continues to stun audiences more than 40 years later. For my money, it's the greatest werewolf film ever made. I'm pretty sure that the first thing that comes to mind when you mention the word werewolf to today's common moviegoer, the first thing they'll think of is Jacob Black, Abs, and Twilight. And why not? With such iconic, profound, beautifully written dialogue like this.
Bella! Where the hell have you been, Luca?
I don't know where I've been.
How can you blame them? Joking aside, werewolf movies truly took a dip in quality post-1981. After An American Werewolf in London, there was a slew of werewolf films throughout the 1980s and 90s that tried to capitalize on the popularity of the genre. And for the most part, they're all pretty bad. Michael J. Fox appeared in 1985's Teen Wolf, which is really just too silly to take seriously. Then there was Wolf with Jack Nicholson in 1994, which has some fans but is mostly forgotten in the greater scheme of things, especially when considering Nicholson's mostly solid resume. 1996 produced a money-grabbing spin-off to An American Werewolf in London called An American Werewolf in Paris, which is one of the worst films I've ever seen from that decade. It's not even one of those movies that you could say is so bad that it's good, because it's just flat out awful. It's terribly acted, has a B-movie vibe about it, and it's painfully unfunny despite trying very, very hard to be. By the 2000s and 2010s, there was a resurgence in the genre mostly due to the popularity of the Twilight books and movies. There was also the Underworld series, which began in 2003 and featured Scott Speedman as the resident Lycan. In 2011, MTV adapted Teen Wolf as a TV series starring Tyler Posey and Dylan O'Brien. Truthfully, I watched season 1 of this show while working on this episode, and it's not that bad. In fact, it's quite entertaining, and I see why it has a strong following if you like the One Tree Hill meets Twilight vibe. All of these new millennium werewolves are more the Jacob Black abs type, rather than the broody Larry Talbot kind. The only mainstream werewolf from this era that wasn't sexualized by hormonal teenagers was Benicio del Toro's iteration of Larry Talbot in Universal's critically panned remake of The Wolfman. Sadly, the only good thing to come out of that movie was the 7th Oscar win for Rick Baker, who designed the makeup. Beyond populist films and properties, I'm sure there are a ton of indie movies out there that feature werewolves. Unfortunately, I haven't seen any of them. During my search to watch as many werewolf films as I possibly could, I ran into some titles I've never heard of. Unfortunately, they all proved to be hard to locate on home video or through streaming. Perhaps they'll be hidden gems forever. I hope you learned a little bit about the history of werewolves from this visual essay. It's true that there are more stinkers than there are good ones, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't enjoy them for what they are: entertainment. If you love Twilight, go for it. If Teen Wolf is your thing, embrace it. They play an equal role in the fascinating evolution of this genre just as much as The Wolfman or An American Werewolf in London did. Hopefully, in the not-so-distant future, there will be another John Landis, or Curt Siodmak, or Rick Baker, or Joe Dante, or even Stephenie Meyer, who once again reinvigorates the werewolf genre for a whole new generation of moviegoers.